Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In doing so, Quebec is passing legislation that preemptively suspends the fundamental freedoms, legal and equality rights of all its citizens. QCGN rejects the notion that our governments can set aside our fundamental freedoms in the name of the collective good. Governments do not decide what rights and freedoms individual Canadians and Quebecers possess. Governments are accountable to us, not the other way around. Bill 96 effectively creates a charter-free zone with respect to a wide range of interactions between individuals and the state in Quebec. The Charter of the French language touches on commerce, employment, education, access to public services, expression in a range of contexts, and the operation of our legal system. Where rights that would otherwise be protected are infringed, the courts under Bill 96 will not be able to review and remedy the conduct under either the Canadian or the Quebec charters. Further, this bill positions the Quebec nation as holding collective rights, although these rights are not defined. And the bill places the National Assembly and not our courts as the arbiter between these collective rights and individual human rights. Tomorrow, we will unveil the preliminary results of polling that indicate no one wants to cede individual rights in favor of the collective rights of Francophones in Quebec, not even the Francophones. All would prioritize personal privacy, the right to health care, and the right to defend oneself in a court of law over the collective rights of Francophones. Generally speaking, no one wants Anglophones pushed out of Quebec. Francophones do not believe that this will be a consequence of Bill 96. Anglophones believe it will be, to the detriment of Quebec's economy. Francophones believe that the proposed changes will increase their economic opportunities. All Quebecers, including Anglophones, Allophones, and Francophones, have much more in common than they realize. All would say we have bigger fish to fry than Bill 96. COVID-19 vaccinations are a top priority for all the groups. Here is a question we need to ask over and over. Why does protecting the French language require the blanket suspension of human rights? The way I see it, the way QCGN sees it, the way our community sees it, it really doesn't. It hasn't needed it before, so why now? There is a lot on with Bill 96, and we need to work hard to understand what that is and to explain it to our communities and our legislators. History judges societies by how they treat their minorities. With Bill 96, I think, and QCGN thinks, Quebec is at a crossroads. The path that Quebec takes with Bill 96 will determine how history unfolds in this province and in Canada at large. The QCGN will always defend the rights of Quebec's minority English speakers, and indeed, the human rights of all Quebecers. Let's get a discussion started, and let's keep asking those questions and shedding more light on this bill. I'm pleased to introduce Royal Orr, who will be the host and moderator of this evening. Royal, I turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Marlene. A great pleasure to be here with you all this evening, and welcome to everyone joining us from right across the province. We do have a distinguished panel to get things underway, and as Marlene has sketched out for us, human rights are on the table again. Human rights threatened in a way that many people find chilling and very disturbing. Joining us to talk a little bit about this for the next half hour or so, three distinguished panelists: Warren Kinsella, founder of the Daisy Consulting Group and former senior political advisor to Jean Chrétien. Pearl Eliadis is a human rights lawyer, author, and professor at McGill University. And also, we're joined by MNA, former MNA and MP, Cliff Lincoln, a great elder of our community, an advocate of the English-speaking community, a promoter of the French language in his career, and a solid defender of human rights. Thank you three for being with us. We look forward to hearing from you. I think I want to start just opening up and having each of you maybe talk for a couple of minutes about what you see happening right now in Quebec and Canada. And I think I'm going to turn to Cliff first of all, because of your long experience of provincial and federal politics. And as I mentioned before, your staunch defense of human rights. Cliff, what the hell is going on here?
Well, I should mention, Royal, that I am a Quebecer by choice. I used to live in British Columbia. I came here because I love this place. It's bicultural nature, the two languages which I speak and write, and this very special character of Quebec, which is buoyant, peaceful, tolerant, friendly. In all the years I've been here, which is many years, I have never had one slight little tiff or argument or fight about language and culture. People get along until you introduce politics into it. And when I looked at Bill 96, the first thing that came to me was something that Nelson Mandela had written and I'd committed to memory. And he said this, I went from the idealistic view of the law as a sword of justice to a perception that the law can be used by the ruling class as a tool to shape society towards what is favorable to itself. And I think this describes Bill 96. When I read it, I was appalled that we cast the Constitution aside, we change the Official Languages Act, we bring in terrible constraints to the point where people can't even speak in a business in English to each other. We introduce the notwithstanding clause in a sweeping way. I know I was involved in a debate in 1998, as you know, Royal, and it referred to a judgment of the Supreme Court of a commercial science. That was bad enough, but this time it is a sweeping use of both the notwithstanding clause of both the Quebec Charter and the Canadian Charter to suddenly declare that Quebec is a paramount nation. And I was thinking on the Day of Indigenous Peoples, I've been working as a volunteer with an Algonquin First Nation for many years. I know them as friends. I've been on the territory, and I wonder what they think. I wonder what Mr. Joselin Barrette, does he feel that the First Nation, the Algonquins and the Mohawks and the others, are they still a First Nation? Or in Quebec, are they a Second Nation? Because Quebec is now a First Nation in his mind. So who are we?
This is a great point. Let's stick with politics a little bit more. Warren, could you kind of give us your perspective on how things are unfolding these days with 96 and C-32 and how human rights are at the center of these debates?
Well, I think that is the way to look at it. 21, Bill 21 and 96, I see as hand in hand, and are equally troublesome. You know, if you forget about the Canadian Charter for a moment, you know, the supreme statute to which there's great attachment in the province of Quebec, of course, is the Quebec Charter. So I'm just getting some little people in the background. Oh, there they go. And, you know, the Quebec Charter, let's just focus on that for a moment. Bill 21 and Bill 96, which really represent the same kind of vision or lack of vision for the province of Quebec and also for the country. They offend the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 38 different sections. And, and when the Quebec Charter was passed unanimously by the National Assembly in 1975, it was done so, I think one of the members said, it would be a guarantee against any violation. Well, that is no longer so. And the thing that is most disturbing, and many people, Andre Pratt, Mr. Lincoln, quite a few of us have commented on the fact, well, why aren't people upset? Who is speaking to these paramount issues, right? The idea of nationhood and personhood. And I think this is regrettably where the pandemic comes in. The pandemic represents the biggest cultural and economic and political and personal upheaval that many of us have faced in our lifetimes. And I think that the Premier Legault reckoned politically, to answer your question, cynically, but correctly, that people were distracted. They were paying attention to their livelihoods, to their families, to their future, and that this would be a perfect time to move. And he was aided and abetted in that regard by Prime Minister Trudeau, who, in my opinion, is seeking seats in the province of Quebec at the expense of not just the Federation, but also the Anglophone minority in the province of Quebec. And to hell with the consequences. Okay. But there are already consequences, just very quickly, here in Ontario, where I am, they've invoked the notwithstanding clause in the past few days. Alberta's talking about reopening equalization using this Quebec model. Like I'm going to be the first guy to make mention of a Pandora's box. A Pandora's box has been opened.
Pearl, let's come to you next. In this sort of general framework that is being laid out here, one of the issues that Warren just mentioned was, why hasn't there been more of a response on this? Why have citizens not recognized what seems to be going on here, specifically in Quebec, but as Warren spreads it out, including other provinces in Canada? What's your perspective on that in terms of how this is unfolding and how citizens are reacting or not reacting?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a privilege to be on such a distinguished panel. A couple of things. I completely agree that Prime Minister Trudeau is courting Quebec votes, and given the timing, his initial response of, there's not much to see here, folks, let's move on, I think is a political calculation. I would remind everybody that we've been down this road before with Bill 14 many years ago that was introduced by the.
We seem to have lost that feed. Has everyone else?
Yeah.
We're gonna have to try and get back in connection. Pearl, we lost you there for a few seconds. You just started talking about the other piece of legislation.
So a number of years ago, Bill 14 was introduced by the PQ, many similar provisions, not including the notwithstanding clause, but many similarities to the current bill. And it also seems to me that one of the things the CAQ is trying to do is to out PQ.
There again. Seems to be a problem with your connection, Pearl. Maybe you could sign in again, because we do seem to be having some trouble. I'm going to continue with Cliff and Warren and just assume that you can reconnect with us, because at this point, you're still frozen, at least on my screen. Cliff, let's pick up on this point of why not more reaction. Is it just that the Quebec and Canadian charters haven't settled that deeply into the minds of Quebecers and Canadians? I mean, what's going on here that we don't see more anger, like we saw, as Warren mentioned, with Andre Pratt talking about the implications of this? Bill 21, we saw certainly some street demos, but nothing that was particularly widespread, and particularly not in the majority community. What's happening here? Is it just human rights? Isn't that important to Quebecers?
I really believe that the context is very important. If Bill 96 was happening in a country recognized being autocratic, I won't name names, but people know several countries now are so autocratic that they have dictatorial regimes. But here, the average citizen doesn't believe that Quebec or any part of Canada could be that undemocratic as to suspend their fundamental rights. They don't even know what the notwithstanding, most of them, what it says, what the impact of this bill is. If, for instance, people realized that the protections against seizure and confiscation would permit the Quebec government to allow inspectors to get into a business and seize computers and software without any warrant, I think they would be astounded. But the problem is people have taken for granted that the protection of French is important. They don't know the details. And when you get the Prime Minister of Canada agreeing with Quebec about the Quebec nation, agreeing about the only official language being French, voting with the Bloc Québécois of all people, knowing that the Bloc Québécois is objective and is very clear, that the Prime Minister, the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and when the motion was presented, it took an Indigenous person who had been Minister of Justice, Judy Raybould Wilson, to stop the motion from first going through, and the second motion given with notice, she was one of two independents that voted against it. I think it's a real disgrace. The Prime Minister should be ashamed. The Liberal caucus should be ashamed. The ministers that voted for this should be ashamed. That they either they haven't read Bill 96 or they don't know what the importance of it is.
Let me go back to Pearl. Thank you for rejoining us. Hope this time that the connection stays strong. You were just making a point about the Parti Québécois in a similar piece of legislation that didn't include the notwithstanding clause. Clearly, this one has that blanket notwithstanding clause right out of the gate. That's a big change in terms of Quebec politics and what nationalist parties are prepared to do. We've lost that link once again. Or maybe you're just new. No, I think we've lost her. Warren, let me come to you. Can we dig a little bit deeper in? Let me just dig a little deeper into what's happening in the Prime Minister's office that they would do, as Clifford so brilliantly laid out, in terms of why they would do this. We can understand the political calculation about upcoming elections at one level. However, there's levels of principle at work here, constitutions, creating problems for yourself down the road. Is it just that Mr. Trudeau thinks he can kick the can down the road and deal with whatever the result is if he wins the next election? Is that as crass as that?
Yeah, well, I mean, he wouldn't be the first politician, of course, to do that, to put off tomorrow's problems till tomorrow. But this is profound, and it is unnecessary. As with so many other major constitutional changes in the past, as the organization that is kindly hosting us tonight has just simply requested, can we not do, as governments at the federal and provincial level in this country can do, make a reference to a court of superior jurisdiction to seek an idea as to what is the consequence of these profound changes. 96 is 100 pages. There's some extraordinary provisions in there. I've written about some of them for Post Media to try to wake up folks in the rest of Canada. For example, the ability of the so-called language police to enter into a business premises and demand that you hand over your cell phone in order to determine whether an insufficient amount of French had been communicated on it, accessing private messages with individuals and personal information. It's just extraordinary. It is, in my view, completely unconstitutional. And as Mr. Lincoln says, it is just deplorable that the Prime Minister of Canada, this Prime Minister, has agreed to go along with it with no objection.
Clifford, as you mentioned before, you've got a long history here in Quebec. You've watched politics closely, participated directly in it. Why do you think we've reached that point where the government can, in effect, get away with saying, protection of French that sweeps everything else out of the way, that allows everything else to be done. You know, there was a time when René Lévesque was so proud of the new Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms that he sent it to every household, right? So that we would all have a copy to put on the wall. What's been the change over those years such that we're now in this space where the elites of the Journal de Montréal and the CAQ and a large variety of other people think, well, if it protects the French language, we got to allow it.
I think that that René Lévesque served in his time was an independentist for sure. At the same time, he was also very fair, and he believed in human rights. I think the big difference now with Legault is that Legault is an independentist, maybe under a different name, but I don't think he cares about human rights or the English community being swept aside. Part of the design, the long-term design, is to make Quebec an independent state with French as a language, and where the minorities are secondary. And I think this it permeates the thinking, and they've been very cunning and clever in putting out this bill as a defense of a threatened French language, which is a total myth. But people believe this, and people have been sort of brainwashed to a degree. I remember there was one of my colleagues at the National Assembly who was the mayor of Nicolette and became a member of the Liberal Party. And when we were discussing Bill 178, he said to me, Cliff, I listened to you and you seem convincing to me. But if you were like me, from the age of 4 or 5 that I attended school, I've been told that the French language and culture are in peril. He said, this is kind of intrinsic to me now. I can't just get it out of my mind. So whenever people say, oh, your French is threatened, you're losing it, Montreal is taking over, the English are taking over, they do believe it in the regions, they do. And Legault is exploiting this to the hilt, and he couldn't care less about human rights.
Okay, we're going to try with Pearl again. Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
we left you with you sort of starting to make a point about how things may have changed between the PQ when they last put something on the table a little like this or a lot like this, and what we have now with this blanket notwithstanding at the front end.
I think the main thing that's changed is that the opponents of Bill 96 right now have very few allies. The NDP has no interest in alienating Quebec, and indeed has always been more favorable to these kinds of measures than other federal parties. The Conservatives are in the wilderness at the moment, so not much to talk about there. And the Liberal Party of Quebec is really jammed. They simply cannot get elected if they are only addressing the needs of allophones and anglophones in Montreal. So politically, there is no upside. The Quebec government has done a very good job of saying they're pro-business while being anti-immigrant at a time when people are scrambling to get workers, while being anti-business because of the demands that Bill 96 is going to place on business. So they've really managed a double discours, I think, extremely well. That's the political side. I think, frankly, we are not going to get anywhere by wringing our hands about why there are no allies here. I think there needs to be concerted attention paid to advocacy to address the serious human rights issues in this bill. It is an omnibus bill, and it is a bill that fundamentally alters the Canadian human rights framework. It fundamentally alters the Canadian Federation as well.
Warren had made that point in terms of just the scope of this and its potential impact both on the Canadian federal structure, but also in terms of individual human rights. Yeah, you're somebody who studied human rights, Pearl. I want to stick with you just for a moment. You've studied human rights. What do we know in terms of the strategies that are most effective effective in appealing to people to pay attention, to recognize that human rights are at stake, and to respond in a way that defends those human rights? What do we know from the history of the fight for human rights around the world?
Well, there are some local strategies, but there are international strategies as well. I mean, the local strategies include, getting engaged in the clause by clause analysis before the National Assembly. It doesn't sound terribly exciting, but it really is one of the ways that you can methodically and systematically go through in a critical way an analysis of the bill, releasing it in stages to the public. So that's the first point. Getting this before the courts is the obvious second point. I think Warren made an allusion to this earlier, and I think it's worth seeing if a test case can be brought forward very quickly that can start to address some of the issues. And by the way, it is not only about going into businesses and seizing cell phones, although that, of course, is one of them. Up until 1982 in Canada, we had this extraordinary federal power called writs of assistance, which allowed the federal authorities, the RCMP, to go into people's homes and businesses and to seize anything they wanted without any prior judicial authorization or warrant. Many of you may remember that. One of the first cases that came down after the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into force in the early 80s was the Southam case, which said you have a right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. Bill 96 does not require any prior judicial authorization for any form of search and seizure. So, I mean, that is only one of the many infringements. But to get to your question, on the third point, the international one, some of you will remember that Anglophone groups had gone to the United Nations Human Rights Committee earlier in order to seek some kind of a statement or decision from the UN regarding the violation of minority rights. They lost at that time because the UN said, you're a minority within a minority. And that's not the kind of thing that we protect. That understanding of what minorities are has fundamentally shifted in the United Nations. The UN has issued guidelines saying that groups like Anglophone, English-speaking Montrealers, Quebecers in Quebec would constitute a recognized minority. And I think that that would ground an international human rights complaint.
Okay, Warren, back to you. As a couple of people have mentioned now, we don't seem to have any natural allies right now, or no one's stepping up to the plate on our behalf on the federal or provincial level, at least in an effective way, and in most cases, not at all. So what becomes that strategy? How do you develop those allies? How do you put some, I mean, what are the pressure points right now, as you see them, especially at the federal level?
Well, I mean, politics is, I run political campaigns and all of you have been involved in political campaigns. Politics is about symbols. It's about taking the immensity of legal language and the to and fro in politics and reducing it to concepts that people can understand and that they can be motivated by, their hearts and their minds. We certainly saw that with Meech, with Elijah Harper and Claude Ryan and so on, stepping forward in an instance where they didn't have many allies and capturing the attention and the imaginations of people. That is doubly and triply hard now because of the pandemic. And the constitutional example I'd use is about a year ago when the Atlantic provinces did this so-called bubble around themselves, in my opinion, and I didn't look at it necessarily as a lawyer, I looked at it as a commentator, but it was just wildly contrary to Section 6 mobility rights of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It was just, we're going to stop you. In some cases, we're going to use police power to prevent you from entering a province. It's never happened in this country's history before, as far as I'm aware. And people were just completely disinterested in the few who were raising their voices about it. So I guess my answer to your question is recognize the power of the pandemic to crowd out other voices and look for the symbol. And the Anglophones in Quebec are pretty good at this. Look for the symbol, look for the moment that can capture people's attention and motivate them to raise their voices against this offensive piece of legislation.
Any first tries at what that symbol might be, Warren? Any thoughts about what the shape of it might be?
It's a visual. It's always a visual. You think back to Justin's father, at the Saint Jean Baptiste parade, and the rocks raining down on him and people urging him to leave, and he would not. He stayed.
Yeah.
And that captured the attention of the nation and the world. And at that moment, in my view, he became prime minister.
Right.
That is what we need. We need a moment like that of clarity and emotion and power, where we say to Quebecers and to the country and to the world, this is not acceptable. This is a violation of human rights.
Elijah Harper with his eagle feathers standing there.
Yes.
Let's come back to you, Clifford. Any thoughts that you have about the flow of this?
Just one thought. I think the weakness of our case is that it is an English-speaking case. And, you know, we don't count. We don't have clout as English speakers in Quebec politically. Unless you draw recognized francophones that have influence in the milieu and are looked to. Right now, we've got Andre Pratt, we've got Serge Royal, who have spoken a lot, but they are seen as part of the establishment. You know, they're not seen as real Quebecers, they're on our side. And I think we've got to draw to draw more people in, French-speaking, whether from the universities or the milieux, recognize voices that will speak out against the attack on human rights by Bill 96. There's been,
Yeah, Clifford, what about your old home, the Quebec Liberal Party? Do you see Dominique Anglade? Maybe she's just sort of positioning things at this point. Do you see her being that potential voice?
I was hoping she would be, but she's in between a rock and a hard place. The Quebec Liberals are squeezed. If they want to get into power ever, they've got to get elected in the regions. The regions see them as an Anglo party. They've got to broaden. They're in a fix, and so she's got to sort of balance. And she's got no real allies. All the other parties in the National Assembly are against them. So I speak to a lot of my MNA friends on the Liberal side, and they feel totally boxed in. They don't quite know where to go. And before, they used to have the backing of the federal government for questions like this. The federal government now is in bed with the CAQ for electoral reasons, as Pearl put out. O'Toole sold his soul from the first day he was elected to the CAQ. The NDP couldn't care less. So there you're in a real fix.
We need some happy warriors here. I'm feeling a little bit sort of pushed against the wall. Pearl, you were shaking your head when Cliff said, expressed some skepticism that Ms. Anglade would become a spokesperson on this.
Well, only because I just think it is hopeless to ever think that she would have gone the right way for political reasons. I'm actually in agreement with Mr. Lincoln. But I do want to say that initiating strong legal action soon is the happy warrior route. Getting this issue before the courts is important. Even if, as we saw in Bill 21, the Superior Court, for example, does what it did under Bill 21 and says, this is a really bad piece of legislation, but there isn't a whole lot that we can do about it. At that point in time, it may be possible to go straight to the United Nations Human Rights Committee and to say it's pointless to expect us to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. It's pointless to expect us to exhaust our domestic remedies because the legislation clearly states that this applies notwithstanding the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, I think we do need to go to the courts. We need to get this in front of the international community. We need to get international conversation going. We need to get this in the New York Times. We need to get this in the international papers. We need to get international attention paid to this issue. And the last thing I want to say on this point is the English-speaking community and the Allophone community in Quebec are not the same monolithic English speakers as exist in the rest of Canada. It is a distinct community within a distinct community, and that needs to be recognized. And I'm sure, based on the United Nations guidelines, that is a community that today would be recognized, that 20 years ago it would not.
Okay, Warren, I want to come back to you for a moment. Pearl was already pointing us in the direction of, in effect, a media strategy here. What do you think are the building blocks of the media strategy? Maybe as we wait for that compelling visual that we're all going to need at some point, what are the blocks you put in place? How do you approach this? How do you start building the case such that when that moment comes, you're not just starting from ground zero?
Well, I'll give, and I can give no better advice than the advice I followed myself. So I've written a number of columns for Post Media about 96 and 21 and the nationalist tendencies of the CAQ. And the reaction I've gotten from a lot of my readers is, to hell with them, we're sick of hearing about this. We're going to help them pack, let them go.
Yeah.
And that, regrettably, that is the reaction in some parts of English Canada. My response to them is, if you don't like the Constitution now, you're going to dislike it even more in the future, because you are going to be hearing about it relentlessly, endlessly. You will be hearing about the Constitution, because what Quebec is doing here is creating a roadmap for other provinces who are similarly nationalist or selfish or craven or cowardly to do the same thing. Kenny's reaction, a former federal minister, his reaction to this was, this is a great blueprint. It's one that Alberta is going to adapt and adopt in its dealings with the federal government. If that didn't wake up the federal government, I don't know what. So, I mean, the media strategy has to be to reach to, you know, the greatest number, Joe and Jane front porch, and make it real to them in terms that they understand. And that's why I've written about, they can go into your business and take your cell phone. You know, that's something that wakes people up. We need to communicate 96 and 21 to them in a way that they understand.
Clifford, a quick comment from you about media strategies, and specifically, how do we get around the Quebecois empire, right? I mean, it really like, you know, it doesn't matter in some ways what you say or how often you get in the op-ed pages of La Presse or even coverage in La Presse. Getting through that barrier to the millions of Quebecers who consume only that is a major challenge for us, is it not?
2 points. Number one, leaving aside the human rights and the application of notwithstanding clause to charters, one thing that struck me when I read this complicated bill, where you lose yourself in verbiage and administrative snafus, I thought to myself, if you're an investor from Switzerland, from the United States, from British Columbia or Ontario into Quebec, and you read and you go to your lawyer, corporate lawyer, and say, could you tell me what the pluses and the minuses are investing in Quebec? They read this bill, they say, don't touch Quebec with a barge pole. And the second point too is that all the provinces that compete with us for trade, Trade Commissioner of Ontario, Trade Commissioner of British Columbia, they love to point this thing, to say, you know, you go to Quebec, French only, you can't speak English to each other. So I think the economic argument spells very, very strong, because eventually, if Quebec knows it's going to lose through lack of investment or problems with businesses leaving Quebec, that is a big argument. The second one, I think, must be brought out. If Quebec can invoke Section 45 to declare itself a nation and have French as its official language, what is to stop some provinces under 1867 can do it, but British Columbia could do it, Nova Scotia could do it. Say, okay, same thing, we'll invoke 45 and we'll make English the only language of Nova Scotia or British Columbia. What does the federal government do then? And I think we should bring that out as well.
One last thing I want to touch on before I get a bit of a wrap-up comment from each of you, and that is the generational difference in reaction, the generational difference in terms of how we need to speak to one another as citizens. Pearl, you work at a university. You probably have more connection with young Quebecers than the rest of us on the panel. What's your perspective of how this breaks down in terms of the generational attitudes to this issue and potentially the generational attitudes to these new attacks on human rights?
It's a really interesting question. My students in both the law faculty and to some extent in the public policy school were overwhelmingly, deeply opposed to Bill 21, regardless of whether they were Francophone, Anglophone, or Allophone, with a couple of exceptions. It was, and especially for the law students who have begun their training understanding human rights and constitutional law, they were really appalled. So I think I don't think we have an indifferent youth. I don't think that we have a youth that does not care about rights. I think that there is a young generation to capture. But at the same time, this is a group of kids who is extremely multilingual, not just French and English. They move between English and French and Spanish and Arabic and whatever else they're speaking, and do so happily. And that positive sense of reinforcement of language, I think, is important. There are some sections of Bill 96 that I'm in favor of, including 6.1, that talks about the importance of making sure that people access good instruction in French, whether they're Anglophone or Francophone. So I think for young people, it's an incredibly important point. And I want to close this remark by circling back to what Marlene said at the beginning about Indigenous people. When we talk about nations, we already have 600 plus First Nations in Canada. Quebec would be one more. Maybe from that perspective, it doesn't matter very much, but I think Quebec wants this to be something different.
Okay,
and I think it'll be something worse.
One quick question, one follow-up on what you just said, Pearl. Should we wrap together 21 and 96 in our battle, or are we better off wrapping together 96 and C32? You know what I mean? Is it more official languages or more human rights?
Well, I mean, in the media debate, I think you want to talk about both, because I think there has been a steady pattern, and that pattern needs to be understood. I think in a court battle, I think that's a different answer. But people need to understand this as a steady erosion of rights that is being achieved through a legislative agenda.
And so the lack of reaction to 21, I mean, many people did react, but it wasn't a kind of a widespread, vociferous reaction. The lack of reaction to 21 is because we were mid-pandemic and just didn't see it coming, or is it something deeper?
Mid-pandemic, I mean, I think Warren's right that you need to understand and take into consideration the context of the pandemic. But it's also because you had a very erudite and thoughtful judgment from the Superior Court of Quebec saying our hands are basically tied.
Okay, we got about 3 minutes here, friends. So what I'm wanting to do is ask each of you to give me about a minute, a bit of a wrap up, a perspective on where we're going from here. I think we need to kind of point it forward at this point. Who'd like to lead off on that there, the last minute wrap up? Warren.
I was afraid you would say that. Okay, first offense, $30,000. Second offense, $60,000. Third offense, $90,000. And each day you contravene 96, if it is in fact passed into law by the National Assembly, each day constitutes a new offense. That is an extraordinary piece of legislation. It is authoritarian in its essence. It will fundamentally change the lives of Quebecers. And, going back to what Pearl said, there is a way of appealing to people's self-interest here. The business community needs to wake up. Not only are contracts going to be tied up, the ability of Quebec businesses to access capital and do business internationally is going to be greatly circumscribed by this legislation. We need to appeal to people where they live in a way that they understand and get them to understand the grave nature of the threat that they now face.
Pearl, moving forward.
Let me build on Warren's comments. If you go through that series of fines and you find yourself before the courts, potentially even in a contempt of court situation and could end up in jail, or with fines that exceed what the courts would normally recognize, you no longer have the protection of the right to be free from cruel and unusual treatment, which, by the way, includes the right to be free from torture. Now, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, but I think it's worth pointing out that they have not withstanded that as well. Just so you know, in closing, language rights are human rights. They're part of the national framework. They're part of the international law framework. This bill is fundamentally seeking to recharacterize Quebec within Canada, and therefore Canada and its relationship with Quebec, and it needs to be opposed strongly.
Clifford, send us out the door with a bit of fire in our breasts here.
Well, I really believe that one thing Quebec nationalists and nationalist government are the most sensitive about is the image of Quebec overseas. And Pastagate and Matzo Gate have done more to portray Bill 101 and the constraints, the stupidity of measuring science. Have done more than anything else we have done, because suddenly they became international news. I think if we can pinpoint, as Warren suggested, some visuals, some highlights. For example, just pick the part where you can enter into a business without a warrant and seize computers and iPhones, and make this one highlight, which I think British or French or Germans or Spanish, anybody would find this abhorrent. And I think this is what the Quebec government fears the most, to look ridiculous in the eyes of the world, because they believe they're a real country already. So I think that's where we should put our efforts in as well.
Cliff Lincoln, Pearl Eliadis, Warren Kinsella, thank you for being with us this evening and kicking us off in this great way. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I see
Thanks,
people.
Royal.
I see people applauding in the little screen that I have here. Thank you all very much. So, thanks for the insights. Really gives us, I think, something to think about, a little bit to chew on in terms of where we might go in terms of next steps. Next on the agenda this evening, we've got a special appearance from Montreal YouTuber Matthew Giuffrida, whom you may know from his Bonjour Hi skits. Enjoy.
Bonjour, hi. I'm here to talk to you about why we should burn out the construction cones. Was that? Oh, it's the wrong conference. Oh, this is the English people conference. Okay, je m'excuse, I'm sorry. Okay, I restart, okay? You see, I removed the bonjour because we don't need that here. Anyway, we have a lot to talk about, okay? Because a lot of stuff happened over the past couple years, even just past couple months, okay? This morning, I was thinking, in Quebec right now, there's two pandemics, okay? There's the COVID-19 and there's the English people. And the Quebec government is trying to get rid of both of them, okay? Even just the beginning of the year, with the whole espresso, the granita, it made me go crazy, man. I don't understand. How can you do this to small business, man? Technically, they're like harassing them in the probable worst possible time ever, man. I mean, and not to mention all the resource that they're using, the cold hard taxpayer cash. I mean, honestly, I would rather they just build a massive, ginormous slip and slide on St. Catherine, huh? I mean, it's already under construction anyway, so why not? Anyway, back to the main issue, What's wrong with talking English, man? I thought that the more language you know, the better off you are as a person or something. Look at me, man. I speak English, I speak Français, I even know Italian sign language, man. It's perfect. But anyway, look, I understand that they're trying to preserve their language as if it's like a can of jam or something, But if they keep doing what they're doing, they're gonna push away all the people, man. And then we're all gonna have to move away. And Franklin, I don't feel like moving away, man, because then you have to restart a whole new life, new friends. You have to find a new dry cleaner. You know how hard that is? Some dry cleaner, he's used too much soap. They don't use enough soap. Some other ones, he don't get rid of all the wrinkle, man. Hey, it's pas facile, man. It's not easy to find a new dry cleaner. But anyway, I digest. Listen, what I'm trying to say, is Bill 96, he need to be ripped up and used to wipe my windows, let's say, like the fantastic Windex, something nice and clean. And
We're about Trudeau, he said he wants to make French like the only officiated language of Quebec, Paul.
I'm going to remain very calm, okay, because I have to keep this profesh here, but why? Why does he do this, man? You know what? I was going to run for the mayor of Montreal, but I think I'm just going to run for prime minister because Justino over there, I don't know what he's doing. Maybe it's all the product he put in his luscious hair, it's sinking into his brain and he can't think straight or something, But I'm going to win and I'm going to take charge and I'm going to take everyone, English, French people, all the language, everyone, and together we're going to bring Canada to the next level. And when we get there, free granito for everyone. What you do?
is hard to find a new dry cleaner. No question about it. Well, I'd like to welcome now QCGN Legal Counsel Marion Sandilands to give us a bit of a presentation about Bill C-32. Our panelists talked about the importance of engaging and understanding what this legislation or these legislations or proposed legislations mean. That's one of the things we have to do is to dig into Bill C-32, otherwise known as the Modernization of the Official Languages Act. Marion is an associate at Conway Baxter Wilson Litigation, and she teaches Canadian federalism law at the University of Ottawa. Recently hired by QCGN to complete legal analyses of Bills 96 and C-32. It is a great pleasure, Marion, to have you with us. Welcome.
Thanks, Royal. I'm back again. Sick of me yet?
Not sick of you at all because of the insight that you give us. So we've got the presentation. I'm going to just stand back and maybe we'll have a little bit of time to talk at the end, but looking forward to this analysis that you've got for us this evening.
Thanks. And this the comedy routine put me in the right mood to talk about this, and I'll be continuing the construction theme. Who knew? So I'm here to talk about Bill C-32 today, an act to amend the Official Languages Act and make related and consequential amendments to other acts. What a catchy title. It's National Indigenous Peoples Day, and so I will say first that I come to you today from Ottawa, which is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. Next slide, please. So, where are we? How did we get here? I just wanted to, before I get into C-32, I wanted to zoom out and give a little bit of context. We have two things happening in Quebec City and in Ottawa. In Quebec City, we've just seen another discussion about Bill 96. We have the CAC majority with, I agree with Pearl Eliadis when she says there's a coherent legislative agenda here. And I would say also a state building project that has been presented in the form of Bill 96. And we have a strong CAC government doing this. In Ottawa, we have a minority parliament. We have most likely an election coming up. That's the political context. What has happened in the past month and a week? We have on May 13th, the tabling of Bill 96. In Ottawa, we had a very big week last week. On June 15th, we got the tabling of Bill C-32, which is the changes to the Official Languages Act. And on the same day, we had the retabling of the block motion and its passage on the next day, June 16th. That was last week. Next slide, please. So the two things that happened last week, as I said, are the block motion and the tabling of Bill C-32. This is the wording of the opposition motion, the block motion that was passed in the House. It says what it says. The debate on the motion presented a variety of views of what it means, but what I will tell you is that the second half of that motion mirrors almost word for word the constitutional amendment that is in Bill 96. I don't want to spend too much time debating this, but if you listen to the debates, you'll see there's a great difference of opinion between members of parliament as to what this motion actually did and what it means. The Bloc Québécois thinks it means something pretty major. Other MPs said it doesn't mean anything at all. Well, just as a note, it was passed 281 yay, 2 nay, and those 2 nays are 2 independent MPs. And some 30 or 40 abstentions, including roughly 9 Liberals from Quebec, who, by the way, paid the price in the Journal de Montréal a couple of days ago. Next slide, please. So we are here. Bill C-32, which was tabled last Tuesday. And I will say it's the first time since 1988 that a sitting government has tabled amendments, substantive amendments to the Official Languages Act. Next slide, please. Where is here? How did we get here? When has a sitting government ever tabled substantive changes to the Official Languages Act? It's happened, this is the third time ever. It happens when politics heat up to a certain temperature, and perhaps I would call it a constitutional temperature. Here on the slide is a list of the two previous times that this has happened. 1969, the tabling of the first Official Languages Act, and 1988, the tabling of the rewrite of the Official Languages Act, and then 2021. And if you want to see more about the history of language rights, I'll put it in the chat, my history of official languages, law in Canada. Oops. Sorry, I didn't do that right. Here we go. Where I get a whole talk about the history of official languages, but you might be worth rewatching that because we're at a moment now. So 1969, that was in response to the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, which tabled its preliminary report in 1965. And they said the following, quote, "Canada, without being fully conscious of the fact, is passing through the greatest crisis in its history. The source of the crisis lies in the province of Quebec. If it should persist and gather momentum, it could destroy Canada." That's what the By and By Commission said in 1965. In 1969, we get the Official Languages Act, which recognizes in law the formal recognition of Canada's two official languages, English and French. And that creates institutional bilingualism of the federal government. That's what the first Official Languages Act did. What happened, the next set of substantive amendments from a sitting government came in 1988. And it's generally believed that this was an update to the Official Languages Act that was needed because of the Canadian Charter that had been passed in 1982. But let's pause a moment here and rethink what else was going on in 1988. 1987, Meech Lake agreed to by the premiers, and in 1988 was going through a ratification process by the provinces, which, as we know, ultimately failed. What else happened in 1988? Well, I've been reading a lot of constitutional history these days. And of course, the Ford decision of the Supreme Court of Canada was handed down in 1988. And that's a decision where the Supreme Court struck down a couple of provisions of the Quebec's Charter of the French language on the basis that they violated freedom of speech. What happened next? The invocation of the notwithstanding clause by Robert Bourassa and the Liberal Party. That all happened in 1988, the same year, although after. So the Official Languages Act was passed in July of that year, and the Ford and notwithstanding debacle came in December. Some of you lived it. I'll tell you exactly how old I was. This was around Christmas time, and I kept hearing the word notwithstanding clause, but I thought it meant notwithstanding clause. That's what I think about when I think of the notwithstanding clause. Anyway, 1988 Official Languages Act, it rewrites whole chunks of the act. And it adds a new purpose to the act, which is to support the development of English and French linguistic minority communities, and declares a commitment on the part of the Government of Canada to enhance the vitality of English and French linguistic minority communities in Canada. Now, of course, there's only one province in Canada with an English-speaking minority community. So by lovely language and logic, this act officially and overtly recognizes the English-speaking community of Quebec as a minority language community worthy of recognition. It's a lifeline. This is 11 years after the Charter of the French language. And just before, as the Ford decision was being litigated, and just before it was rendered. So it's a turning point. Anyway, there have been no other, I stand to be corrected, but there have been no other substantive amendments tabled by a sitting government. There were amendments in 2005, but those were private members' amendments from the Senate. They were not tabled by a sitting government. What we saw last week hasn't happened since 1988. Next slide, please. So here we are. What are we doing? Construction, constitutional construction. Just to recap, why are we here? Perhaps it has something to do with Bill 96. Next slide, please. So 2 points to make about the Official Languages Act before I do launch us into a review of the actual C-32. 2 points I want to make. First, the Official Languages Act is highly symbolic. This is both a strength and weakness of the Act. I've studied it in depth. It has a lot of declarations, a lot of beautiful language, and it's a lot of recognition of ideas and principles and policies. It's been criticized, rightly so, that it doesn't actually come with a lot of teeth. It doesn't have a lot of enforcement. It really depends on political will. And a lot of it really is just policy framework. It isn't really enforceable. And the Official Languages Act, as I've just showed you, doesn't change very often. And when it does change from a sitting government, it changes a lot. Second point, modernization of the Official Languages Act has been in the works for a long time. This is not a surprise. This legislation has been in the drafting for quite some time. The QCGN was involved with the modernization process for several years. I've been involved for three years. And the QCGN had filed several briefs, and many members of the QCGN as well had filed several briefs with the Senate, the House of Commons Committee, with the Department of Canadian Heritage. There had been a long dialogue, and there was a consensus reached in 2019 among official language minority communities about how to strengthen the Act in favor of official language minority communities. And the QCGN was part of that consensus. What's changed? Well, we have the pandemic, but we also have Quebec, which made its position known, and the political dynamics which we saw, and that has changed the complexion of the project. And there were also, the Minister Joly put out a white paper in February, and the QCGN and others reacted to that as well. And they filed briefs with the Senate Official Languages Committee. And Chelsea, now is the moment to put the link to the QCGN's brief in the chat. If anyone's interested, you can see the full position that the QCGN put forth after that white paper was tabled. Next slide, please. Which brings us to Bill C-32 itself, which was tabled in the House, which does implement all of the something's changed, Chelsea. Bill C.
Sorry, in an attempt to share the link, I unshared my.
Oh, no worries, Chelsea. I'll just throw it into the chat now. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Here goes. Bill C-32 implements the policy proposals from the white paper. Very little changed from the white paper to what we saw in Bill C-32, despite the QCGN and others putting on the record their concerns with that white paper. But here we are, Bill C-32, a left turn in language policy. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Chelsea. Thank you. So now we're finally here. I've got 4 categories of things to talk about, and they all start with P. Preamble, purpose, policy and positive measures, private businesses, and policing the Act. Next slide, please. So preamble and purpose. Don't fall asleep. As I said, the Official Languages Act is very symbolic. The preamble and the purpose clause are actually really important in this bill. They are signaling, they are symbolic, and they are important. So what's happened in the preamble and purpose clauses? A lot. We get a recognition of the special status of the French language for the first time in the preamble. We get a formal recognition of the Charter of the French language. Now, just note, English-speaking Quebec does continue to be recognized under the Official Languages Act as an official language minority community. That stays. And the bill also creates additional space to acknowledge Indigenous languages, albeit outside the OLA. And in fact, that's already really happened because the federal government passed the Indigenous Languages Act a couple of years ago. But it's now sort of, there's a nod to it in the Official Languages Act, or in Bill C-32 anyway. And there's some new interpretive principles that seem to codify the law already, but might take on a new complexion with all these other new things. Anyway, let's go to the next slide, please, so we can actually look at the purpose clause. Hey, it's a Monday night, we're going to read some legislation. Oh, sorry, it got cut off at the bottom there. But the purpose clause has been rewritten. Oh, we've lost the screen share again. Sorry, Chelsea. Is that okay? Here we go. So the first one there, A, yes, we still see the recognition of English and French as the official languages of Canada. Great. B has changed. It's now supporting the development of English and French linguistic minority communities in order to protect them. Little gloss there, but you do see that recognition of the minority communities. It's in there. It's just changed a little bit. B.1, taking into account that French is in a minority situation in Canada and North America due to the predominant use of English. This is a phrase that gets repeated in other places in the Act. It's right here in the purpose clause too. C remains the same. By the way, the white stuff is new. The black stuff is already there. So C remains the same. The duties of federal institutions, fine. D, which is cut off there, talks about fostering the use of French, not English and French, French, by federally regulated private businesses in Quebec and regions with a strong Francophone presence. Sorry, that got cut off. So that's brand new and it's in the purpose clause. So overall, what's happening here, I've taken the purpose clause as an example, but it's happening in the preamble and it's happening in other places in the Act. We're seeing an explicit reorientation of the Official Languages Act toward the protection and promotion of the French language everywhere in Canada. This is a brand new policy objective in the Official Languages Act. The effect, unknown. Is it a merely symbolic? Is it a statement of policy? Or will it affect the interpretation of Official Language Act rights for everyone, including English-speaking Quebecers? And if so, what will be the effect on the rights of English-speaking Quebecers? And in particular, what will be the effect of all of this on the scope of the Part 7 rights and support for the English-speaking organizations in Quebec? Next slide, please. I've previewed this, but here's our hazard. So we have a recognition in the preamble and the purpose that French is a minority situation in Canada and North America due to the predominant use of English, new language. We have also the explicit recognition of the Charter of the French language in the Federal Act. And we have an explicit commitment by the Government of Canada in the Act to protecting and promoting the French language. There's also this new concept of advancement towards the equality of status of English and French, which is jargon, but it's actually ripped straight from the Canadian Charter, because the Canadian Charter allows governments, the federal government, it says nothing prevents the government from advancing the equality of status of English and French. But here, the way it's used in the Official Languages Act, in Bill C-32 in particular, it seems to be tilted, it seems to be code for the protection of the French language. I could be out on a limb here, but I've looked at the provisions and this is the interpretation that jumps out at me. So does advancement of the equality of status mean the status of the French language? That's in that purpose clause I just read you. It seems to say it. It says it pretty explicitly. And how does the link to the Charter of the French language fit in there? Is the Act saying that the Charter of the French language itself advances the equality of status of French and English? That's the obvious interpretation that jumps out when you read these provisions together. And again, we see the invocation of the Charter of French language in the preamble, and we see it again in Part 7, which I'll get to in a minute. So that's something that definitely merits some attention and some thought and perhaps some amendments. Next slide, please. Part 7. So Part 7, for those of you who aren't, who haven't memorized the Official Languages Act, that's the part that talks about the Government of Canada's commitment to promoting and supporting official languages. And it creates the framework for all of the federal support to official language minority community organizations, including those in English-speaking Quebec. So it's quite important for a lot of stakeholders in English-speaking Quebec. And it's been overhauled. Part 7 was criticized by everyone, including the QCGN, as not having enough teeth, needing more detail. And so now it has more detail, although it doesn't really have any more teeth. So there aren't any new regulations, which is something that would have helped. And it doesn't look like anything's changed in terms of the enforceability of Part 7, but there is more detail. So let's look at some of that detail. So there are new commitments. So this is where we really get statements of policy. New commitments by the Government of Canada towards official language minority communities. Yes, still there, good. But also some new ones, three new ones. The first one is the promotion and protection of the French language. The second one is committed to estimating those who are rights holders under Section 23 of the Charter. And the third one is a commitment to supporting quality education in the minority language along a continuum from early childhood to post-secondary. There are also new details on the positive measures, these famous positive measures that every government institution is supposed to take or may take. And these positive measures are all may. The government institutions may do the following. They must do something, but they may do a bunch of the following things. And note, these federal institutions will now have the duty to take positive measures with respect to two Government of Canada commitments. The first one is the protection of minority language communities. That's the existing one. And the second one is the new one, which is the promotion and protection of the French language. So that really widens what these federal institutions are supposed to be doing. And there's a new list of what these positive measures may include. Some of them include support sectors that are essential to the vitality of official language minority communities, including culture, education, health, justice, and immigration sectors, and also to promote strong institutions serving those communities. That's good language for the QCGN and for English-speaking organizations generally. That's the detail that the QCGN was asking for. But next slide, please. What else does it say? Look at down in the bottom left text box there, 41.2.1, positive measures shall respect the necessity of protecting and promoting the French language in each province and territory. So we get a lot of may in the Official Languages Act, but this one's a shall. What does this mean for the positive measures to support English-speaking community of Quebec? Don't know. What else do we see in Part 7? This new 45.11b. I will decode it for you. So there's a recognition that in order for the federal government to do a lot of this stuff, they need to cooperate with the provinces, right? A lot of this does do things that are really in provincial jurisdictions. So in order for the federal government to spend the money, they need to cooperate with the provinces. We know that already, that's already in the Official Languages Act, but this is really strengthening that idea. It's pairing it with this idea of the advancement of equality of status of French and English, which I've talked about what I think that might mean in Bill C-32. And then it explicitly invokes Quebec's Charter of the French language. What's going on there? And what will that mean after Bill 96 passes? What does it mean? Does it mean the Fed is deferring to Quebec and the Charter of the French language as changed by Bill 96? Remember, Bill 96 has its own policy objectives, and Bill 96 attempts to narrowly define who's entitled to government services in English in Quebec. Is that the kind of thing that the federal government is now going to take into account? We've been asking for clarification about these two provisions. I've asked twice. We're waiting to hear what the drafters think these mean for English-speaking Quebec. Yet to receive a coherent answer. If this doesn't have legal significance because it's Part 7, it's not enforceable, it's only symbolic, it's only a statement of policy. Okay, so what policy is this signaling? What is this telling English-speaking Quebecers? Anyway, next slide, please. The third topic private businesses, which are federally regulated. I needed it to start with P. So here, there's a whole new couple of sections in Bill C-32 that they're going to add some new sections to the Official Languages Act to create rights for services and communications and the right to work in French in federally regulated businesses in Quebec, but also in regions of Francophone presence, which haven't been defined, which will be defined in regulations. So what is this code for? This is code for applying something that looks a lot like the Charter of the French Language to federally regulated enterprises in Quebec, which are currently not subject to the Charter of the French Language. So this is a way to impose similar obligations through the federal legislation. It's going to apply to, so federally regulated private businesses are banks, telecom companies, transportation companies, including railways, airlines, etc. Note, however, Air Canada, CN, and NAV Canada will continue to be subject to the Official Languages Act. So that's a little bit weird, but there you have it. There'll be a new right for consumers to receive services and communications in French, and then a duty on those businesses to provide those services in French. There's a new right to work, to be supervised, receive communications from your employer, and use work instruments in French in these workplaces. And the duty is on the businesses to ensure that that right is fulfilled. And in an interesting legal turn, the Official Languages Act will say that Quebec businesses can choose whether, so the federally regulated businesses can choose whether they want to be subject to the Official Languages Act regime or whether they want to be subject to the Charter of the French Language. Many of them are already complying with the Charter of the French Language, but it's an interesting legal device to get to choose which jurisdiction you want to be under. This will also create a right for employees to make complaints to the Commission of Official Languages with respect to their language of work rights. So new role for the Commissioner of Official Languages as well. I think that applies to services actually as well. So that's federally regulated private businesses in a nutshell. Next slide, please. And finally, my last P, policing the act. But before I get to that P, I want to talk about something that doesn't start with P, which is changes to the Supreme Court of Canada. So this was in the news. Bill C-32 is going to essentially require that litigants in front of the Supreme Court be understood in their official language of choice without the assistance of an interpreter. Right now, that's the case for all other federal courts, but not the Supreme Court. There's an exception, and it's going to remove that exception. So it's generally believed that this means that Supreme Court judges will have to be functionally bilingual, which is consistent with the current Liberal Party policy of appointing functionally bilingual judges, but it will enshrine it in law. And this, by the way, is something that the QCGN it signaled its support for several years ago. Okay, so that didn't start with P, but it's important. Anyway, back to policing the act. There's a strengthened suite of enforcement and implementation, which is not that exciting, so I won't talk too much about it. There's a new role for enhanced role for the Minister of Canadian Heritage, an enhanced role for the Treasury Board, although it doesn't fix the structural problem, which the QCGN and the FCFR highlighted, which is that there's no central agency that's really responsible for the whole act. This doesn't change in Bill C-32. The Commissioner of Official Languages takes on an added role, receives new complaints about the whole new French language of work and services piece. The Commissioner has additional discretion and additional enforcement powers, which is something that many people were calling for. So it does give the Commissioner a lot of extra power to enforce the act. Nothing on the scale of the OQLF. There's a new administrative tribunal that's going to have a role in enforcing the Official Languages Act as well. The Canadian Industrial Relations Board is going to deal with complaints on the French language of work. So that's a whole new arm that's going to be involved in the Official Languages Act. There's an enhanced remedy at the federal court for sort of interim interlocutory matters, just a few extra teeth here and there. And there's going to be a 10-year review of the act to be done by the Minister of Canadian Heritage. And with 10-year reviews, It's important to be careful what you wish for, because sometimes the political climate is favorable and sometimes it is unfavorable to change. So be careful what change you want and what review you want. However, this is a pretty light 10-year review mechanism because the minister just tables a review. There's no requirement for any parliamentary process to respond to that review. So it's a pretty light review process. So that's it for Bill C-32 in a nutshell. Next slide, please. I'll just leave you with this question. Where do we go next?
Have you got an answer?
For my presentation.
Yeah. Marion, do you have an answer where we go next, or that you're leaving that open for all of us? Listen, great, ton of information. I'm assuming the PowerPoint and maybe some of your notes will be made available somehow. I've already had some questions on the chat about, you know, how can we get our hands on some of this information so we can start sharing it with the people that we think will be interested in it. So do you have a notion of what the plan is to get this information to people?
I have a notion, which will be one.
Rita,
I think there's a plan to have some kind of public version of an analysis.
Great.
To what was done with Bill 96.
Rita just mentioned on the chat that they are recording this, of course, and this will be available on the QCGN YouTube channel. It was only, I mean, remarkable that you did that in about half an hour to get us through that much information. So that's available. But yes, I'm imagining that this is also going to be turned into easily consumed chunks that people can then use in terms of getting the message out about this legislation, its importance, and what its implications could be for us all. So thank you, Marion, very much for this. Really, really appreciate it. And I think we're all going away with lots to think about, lots to chew on, and certainly a much higher understanding of what C-32 is and what it could mean for us. So thank you again.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Okay. So there we go. That's this evening's program. On that note, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. We had a good long list. I was scrolling through it a couple of times, just seeing who was there. Hi to lots of people that I do know. Great to see your names. Want to remind you that things get underway again tomorrow. This is QCGN's first virtual conference, and the virtual conference continues tomorrow morning. You'll use the same Zoom link that you used to get in this evening. The conference set to begin tomorrow morning at 8:20, and that starts with a keynote speech to be given by Official Languages Minister Mélanie Joly. So I want to thank you all once again for joining us and also wish you a great evening. Bye-bye.